Okay, having been described as a giant, I'll now adjust this microphone. All right, good afternoon. Okay, you did better for Stacy, but I'll take that. All right. It's my honor on behalf of PNC Bank to introduce the luncheon speaker. Richard Rothstein is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, an emeritus senior fellow of the Thurgood Marshall Institute at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and an emeritus senior fellow at the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. His book, The Color of the Law, A Forgotten History of How Government Segregated America, has been well reviewed and much discussed. In it, Mr. Rothstein traces the history of government actions which encouraged and made possible racial housing segregation and the impact of those actions have had on the social, political, and economic lives of all of us as Americans. We at PNC Bank are happy to be a sponsor of this presentation. We agree with the comments by Rachel M. Cohen that said that Rothstein persuasively debunks many contemporary myths about racial discrimination. She goes on to say, only when Americans learn a common and accurate history of our nation's racial divisions will we be able to consider steps to fulfill our legal and moral obligations. We at PNC applaud Mr. Rothstein's contribution to that dialogue. We also applaud the work that all of you do to find solutions to our nation's affordable housing crisis. Our partnership with Montgomery County Housing Opportunity Commission and all that organization has done to provide better lives for so many in Montgomery County is one of our points of pride. As HOC's operating bank, we are proud to have supported the innovative and aggressive, sometimes very aggressive, approaches HOC has used to finance affordable housing, and we look forward to doing our part as a banking institution to be a part of the solution. Now join me in welcoming Richard Rothstein.
Thank you very, very much, Jeff. Stacy, you're an incredible executive director, and all of you are fortunate to have him. Thank you for being here this afternoon to engage with me in this conversation. As you all know, in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began with challenges to the segregation of law schools, because civil rights lawyers figured that if judges were too dense to understand anything else, they might be able to figure out that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated law school. And then they used that precedent to challenge segregation in colleges and universities. And then, as you all know, that led to the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. We just celebrated its anniversary a couple of days ago. That abolished legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And then that Brown decision gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a movement of activism, of marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. People lost their lives in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And by the end of the 1960s, we'd abolished segregation and lunch counters and buses and swimming pools and water fountains and public accommodations of all kinds, interstate transportation of all kinds. Then the civil rights movement folded up its tent and went home, left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. In the course of the previous half century, the country came to understand that racial segregation was wrong. It was harmful to both blacks and whites. It was immoral. It was incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. How could it be, having come to this conclusion, that we left untouched the fact that we are, in fact, an apartheid society? Every metropolitan area is residentially segregated by race. Partly, of course, it's a little bit harder to desegregate neighborhoods than to desegregate water fountains. If we abolish segregation in water fountains, the next day you drink from any water fountain. But if we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things would be much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks, whites, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, Northerners, Southerners, what we've done is adopted a national myth, a rationalization that excuses ourselves from continuing. Okay, that's better. I'm sorry, I don't know how that happened, but what we've done is we've adopted a national myth. I told you he was an incredible executive director. We've adopted a national myth, a rationalization that excuses ourselves from addressing this biggest segregation of all, from accepting an apartheid society. And the myth goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of law schools and colleges and universities and lunch counters and buses and all the rest, that was unconstitutional. That was a violation of civil rights because it was done by government. It was done by public policy, by law, by ordinance, by regulation. If it was done by the federal government, it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, a civil rights violation. If it was done by state and local government, it was a violation of the 14th Amendment, more civil rights violations. And if there's a civil rights violation, we have an obligation as American citizens to redress it. Residential segregation, though, we tell ourselves, oh, that's an entirely different matter. That wasn't done by government. That wasn't done by law or regulation or public policy. That just sort of happened by accident. It happened because bigoted homeowners, white homeowners, wouldn't sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe because actors in the private economy, not government officials, but private actors like bankers or real estate agents, discriminated in how they sold or rented homes in the private economy. Or maybe it's because people just like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way, and that's why we have segregation. Or maybe it's just because of income differences. On average, African American incomes are lower than whites, and many African Americans just can't afford to move to middle-class neighborhoods. All of these individual, personal, bigoted perhaps, but non-governmental decisions is what's created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves it's not a civil rights violation. What happened by government can only, what happened by accident rather, can only unhappen by accident. And we don't like it, but we don't accept the responsibility to do anything about it. Well, we give a name to this myth. It's a name we all use. All of us, as I say, liberals, conservatives, blacks, whites, we call it de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact. Well, I spent much of my time in the last few decades, not on this topic, but studying education policy. I was the education columnist at the New York Times and writing about education policy for a research institute in Washington. I knew nothing about housing. And I came to understand that the education policy we were following in the late 1990s and 2000s made no sense to me. It was nonsense, in my view. The theory was that the reason that African American children had average outcomes that were lower than white children was because teachers had low expectations of those children. The schools didn't try hard enough. And if only we tested the children more and then hold the schools accountable for those test scores, the achievement gap would disappear. It was a ridiculous theory, in my view, and I wrote column after column about it. I'll give you one example. I won't go into it in too much detail. That would be another whole lecture, and I won't do that now. But for example, I remember writing a column about asthma. African American children in urban neighborhoods have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. If they have asthma, they're likely to be up at night, wheezing, drowsy, coming to school sleepless the next day. I said if you have 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, 2 identical groups of children, both same racial makeup, same social and economic backgrounds, same family structure, same family incomes, except one group had a higher rate of asthma than the other. That group was inevitably going to have lower achievement, no matter how high the teacher expectations were, no matter how often they were tested, because testing children doesn't make them more wide awake if they were up at night wheezing. And I went through example after example of the kinds of disadvantages that children living in lower income neighborhoods have. They have more asthma because they live in more decrepit buildings, more pollution in the air, more vermin in the environment. They have lead poisoning because the buildings aren't well maintained. Lead poisoning has a concrete impact on cognitive achievement. They have homelessness, as you all know. They have insecurity from family unemployment. You could do the same kind of exercise with every one of these. You take two groups of children in equal ever respect, but one group has more lead poisoning or more homelessness or more economic insecurity. That group is going to have lower average achievement. And I've been thinking about this, and then after a while I started to put things together. I'm a slow learner, and it gradually dawned on me that what if you have a school where every child has either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or insecurity or stress? How is that school ever going to be expected to achieve at the same level as a school where children come to school well rested and without the poison of lead and with insecure homes? The expectation made no sense. Well, we call those schools where we concentrate children with these disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And the reality is that today schools are more segregated in this country than they have been at any time in the last 45 years. And the reason that they're more segregated is because they're located in segregated neighborhoods. So I began to think that maybe housing policy was education policy. And then I read in 2007 the Supreme Court decision. In 2007, the Supreme Court evaluated a program that two school districts had, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of those districts had a choice plan, a minor token attempt to desegregate. They gave parents the choice of which school and district their child would attend, but if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored. So you had a school that was all white or mostly white, and you had one place left in that school, and both the black and the white child applied for that last place. The black child would be given some preference. It was a token plan. I mean, how often do you have one place left in the school and both the black and the white child apply for it? But the Supreme Court denounced the plan, said it was unconstitutional. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion, and he said, well, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. I thought that was a pretty wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. That's why those schools are segregated. And then he went on to say that the neighborhoods are segregated de facto for all the reasons I just described. And he said if you had de facto segregation, not created by government, but by private bigotry or self-choice and all the things I just went through, there's nothing you can do about it. In fact, it's unconstitutional to do something about it, because if government didn't do it, government can't correct it. Well, I read this decision, and I remembered reading about something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the two districts that this decision involved. And in Louisville, Kentucky, some years before, a white homeowner in a single-family home in a suburban community called Shively had an African-American friend, a decorated Navy veteran, living in the center city of Louisville, renting an apartment. Had a wife and daughter, a good middle-class job. He wanted a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So his white friend in this suburb of Shively bought another home and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry white mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. They dynamited and firebombed the home. Police were there, couldn't figure out who'd done this thing. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to an African-American family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the entire criminal justice system, the police, are involved in maintaining the racial boundaries of Louisville. And so I began the investigation that led to the book that you just heard about. And what I discovered was that this was not an isolated incident of police protection, of mob violence. There were 1,000 cases. I'm not exaggerating, 1,000 cases of mob violence protected by the police in the 20th century to drive African Americans out of homes that they legitimately purchased in previously white neighborhoods. Every one of these was a constitutional violation. Every time the police acted to protect an angry white mob, they were violating the 14th Amendment. These were civil rights violations that were not remedied. And then as I continued my research, I discovered that not only was it state-sponsored violence that created the segregation that we know today, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies, racially explicit policies, that were designed to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area in this country, that created not a de facto system of racial segregation, but an unconstitutional system that offends every one of our responsibilities to enforce constitutional rights and that have never been remedied. So in the few minutes I have this afternoon with you, I want to describe some of the chief federal policies that were designed to ensure racial segregation in this country, as unconstitutional as the segregation of schools or water fountains or buses or law schools. One I'll talk about is one that you're very familiar with, and I hope many of you know this history, and that's public housing. Most people in this country, I'm sure many of you know better, but most people in this country think public housing is a place just where poor people live. Single mothers with children. Lots of young men without jobs in the formal economy because they have no transportation to get to those jobs. The reality is that public housing in this country was begun for the first time in the New Deal during the Depression by the Roosevelt administration. It was not for poor people. Poor people weren't permitted in public housing. It was for working class, lower middle class families who could afford to pay the full cost of housing and their rent. It wasn't a subsidized program. The public housing was paid for by the renters who lived there. There was no housing being built in the Depression in the private economy, so there was a housing shortage. 25% of the workforce was unemployed. Public housing was for the 75% who had jobs. And everywhere that the Public Works Administration of the New Deal built that housing, it segregated it, creating frequently segregation where it hadn't previously existed. That may surprise some of you, many of you not perhaps, but in the early 20th century, we had lots of integrated downtown neighborhoods in this country. They were integrated downtown neighborhoods because, there was none of that internet stuff in those days. It was a manufacturing economy. Factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals. That's where they got their parts and shipped their final products. Workers didn't have automobiles to get to work. So if you had a factory district that employed, Irish immigrant workers and Italians and Jews and African Americans, they all had to live in broadly the same neighborhood so they could walk to their jobs in the factory district. The Public Works Administration demolished integrated housing to build segregated projects, separate projects for whites and blacks, creating a pattern of segregation in many cities that hadn't previously existed. Even in the South. The South may have had segregated water fountains. It didn't have segregated housing because workers had to live close enough to their jobs to walk to work. The first project that was built by the Public Works Administration in the New Deal was in Atlanta. There's a neighborhood near downtown Atlanta called the Flats. It was about half black, half white. The Public Works Administration built the Techwood homes there in Atlanta for whites only. The African Americans who were displaced from their housing as a result of that construction had to double up with relatives elsewhere or find less adequate housing. Hadn't been segregated before, but Techwood homes segregated that community. The great African American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes, I hope many of you are familiar with him. He wrote an autobiography called The Big C. He describes how he grew up in Cleveland, in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. Says his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. That's what happens in integrated neighborhoods. But the Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood, the central neighborhood of Cleveland, to create two separate projects, one for blacks, one for whites, creating a pattern of segregation there, and with other projects elsewhere in the city of Cleveland that reinforced, created, sustained the pattern of segregation that exists to this day. In my book, I like to, where I can, focus on self-satisfied, smug places that think they're better than you are. Cambridge, Massachusetts, for an example. Some of you may be familiar with the area. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. The Public Works Administration segregated it, demolishing housing there to build separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, enforcing separate living for people who previously had been living together. And this, as I say, was done all over the country. In World War II, the policy of the federal government to create segregation intensified. Hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production during the war to take jobs that hadn't existed during the Depression. They overwhelmed the communities where these war plants were located. There was no housing available for them. In the book, I focus on another smug place, Berkeley, California, one I know well. A suburb of Berkeley called Richmond was a center of shipbuilding on the West Coast. It was an all-white community, a small community of about 20,000, all white. By the end of the war, there were 100,000 war workers working in these shipyards, black and white. The federal government built housing for those workers. The city of Richmond couldn't accommodate them, nor could Berkeley. So it built housing for the workers. It built housing for the black workers along the railroad tracks in the industrial area, along the railroad tracks. Shoddy temporary housing. The city of Richmond announced that black workers who came to Richmond during the war would have to leave at the end of the war. So it wasn't necessary to build permanent housing, and it built stable housing for the white workers in the more residential areas of Richmond. Now, this happened throughout the West Coast in the war industries, and we can say confidently that it was solely the federal government that created segregation on the West Coast. There were no previous existing patterns of segregation because there were very few African Americans living on the West Coast prior to World War II. The Great Migration that brought African Americans here and to the Midwest and the East prior to the war didn't exist in the West Coast. So the segregation that we now have in Portland and Seattle and San Francisco and Los Angeles is all attributable exclusively to actions that the federal government took during World War II to create segregated societies that hadn't previously known it. After the war, there was still an enormous housing shortage. Very little private housing was built during the Depression. As I mentioned, just these public works projects building public housing. During the war, it was against the law to use construction materials for civilian purposes unless it was for workers in war plants. And then after the war, millions of returning war veterans were coming home needing housing for whom there was no housing available. They were having babies, the baby boom. There was an enormous housing crisis, much like we have today. President Truman, who was then president, had to somehow address this housing crisis, and he proposed a vast expansion of the National Public Housing Program. Again, remember, we're not talking about poor people. These were returning war veterans, had jobs in the post-war economy, but no housing available for them. They could pay rent, but nobody to pay rent to. So Truman proposed a vast expansion of the public housing program. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat Truman's proposal. They wanted to defeat it not for racial reasons, it was segregated, they were quite happy with that. It wasn't because they didn't like poor people, there were no poor people to speak of living in public housing at that time. They wanted to defeat it because they said that public housing was socialistic. The private economy should take care of the housing needs of returning war veterans, even though the private economy, the private builders were not building any housing for working class families at that time. And so they came up with a strategy to defeat Truman's Housing Act. We refer to it as a poison pill strategy. A poison pill strategy in Congress is one where opponents of a bill propose an amendment that they think can get a majority and will pass. And then when the full bill comes up on the floor of Congress again with this amendment, a different majority, because of the amendment, finds the bill unpalatable and the bill goes down to defeat. So conservatives in Congress in 1949 proposed an amendment to the 1949 National Housing Act as follows. From now on, there can't be any more racial discrimination in public housing. No more separate housing for blacks and whites. We have to have a non-discriminatory program. It was a cynical proposal. They didn't want public housing at all. But they planned to vote for this amendment. They thought they could get some northern liberals to vote with them. That would create a majority. And then when the full bill came up on the floor of Congress as a requirement for a non-discriminatory public housing program, the conservatives would flip and vote against the final bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats, who were all in favor of segregated public housing but not integrated public housing, and the entire bill would go down to defeat. So liberals faced a very difficult choice. I'm not minimizing the difficulty of the choice that they faced, and I'm going to tell you this story because it has enormous analogies to what all of you do today and what we face today. Liberals faced a choice. Were they going to support the integration amendment but not address the very real housing crisis, because if the integration amendment passed, there'd be no public housing built? Or were they going to oppose the integration amendment in order to try to address the housing crisis and get some public housing built, not some, a vast amount of public housing built, on a segregated basis? Well, it wasn't an easy choice. I'm not minimizing it. But they decided to vote against the integration amendment. The leading liberal in Congress at that time was a senator from Illinois. His name was Paul Douglas. He had a close colleague, Mr. Civil Rights, the senator from Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey. And they both led a campaign against the integration amendment in order to preserve public housing. Senator Douglas got up on the floor of the Congress, the floor of the Senate, and made a speech along the following lines. He said, "I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if the integration amendment is defeated and you get the housing that you need than you will be if the integration amendment is passed and you get no housing at all." Well, the integration amendment was defeated. The National Housing Act was passed with the vast expansion of public housing that many of you are familiar with, you administer today. It created, it reinforced a segregated society to an extent that had never before even been known. I'm not so sure that we're better off as a result of that difficult choice that Senators Douglas and Humphrey advocated, but I'm not minimizing the difficulty of the decision. But the decision that they made to support the vast expansion of public housing and the reinforcement of segregation of every metropolitan area in this country not only created the achievement gap in schools that I started out by talking about, it created health disparities whereby African Americans have lower life expectancies, greater rates of heart disease because they live in more dangerous and polluted neighborhoods where they're concentrated. It created the mass incarceration crisis that we have today, which disparately affects African Americans because so many young men are concentrated in neighborhoods where they have no good jobs and where there's not even access to good jobs. I think a consequence of that devil's bargain that Douglas and Humphrey made is also the very, very dangerous, frightening political polarization that we have in this country today. Largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that's so essential to the preservation of this democracy if so many African Americans and so many whites live so far from each other that they can't identify with each other or have any empathy with each other's life experiences? Those are the long-term consequences of the bargain that Douglas made. The short-term benefits were easy and palpable to see. We created a lot of housing that people needed, but we made a trade. And we're making that same trade today. Most of the affordable housing we build today, not all of it, is placed in already segregated low-income neighborhoods. Not all of it. We're making some efforts to do better, but on balance, the affordable housing programs that we have reinforce segregation today and continue the same choice that Douglas and Humphrey made. Very soon after, the vast expansion of public housing that took place under the 1949 Housing Act took place. Another development occurred that was initially very surprising to your colleagues at that time, the public housing officials, public policy analysts. What happened was, all of a sudden, there were large vacancies that developed in the white projects, long waiting lists in the black projects. Soon, the situation became so indefensible, even the most bigoted public housing official at the time couldn't defend the situation where in his city some projects were half empty and the others had long waiting lists. So all the projects were opened up to African Americans. As more and more whites left the projects became disproportionately and then overwhelmingly African American. At about the same time, industry left the cities. no longer needed to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals because the highways were being built. They could get their parts and ship their final products by truck. So the families who were living in public housing, now predominantly African American, no longer had access to the good jobs that they had before, where they were supporting their ability to pay the full cost of rent in public housing. Public housing, as you know and you administer now, had to be subsidized. People didn't pay the full cost of the rent anymore. Once it began subsidized, the federal government and local government stopped investing in it to the same extent they had before, stopped maintaining it. And we got the kind of deteriorated public housing, concentrating the most disadvantaged families that public housing came to be characterized in the late 20th century. The question is, why did all those vacancies occur in the white projects and not in the black ones? And that's because of another federal program that was even more powerful in segregating this country, even than the public housing program. And that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration that was explicitly designed, racially explicit, designed to suburbanize the entire white population, get them out of cities into single-family homes in the suburbs. This was an explicit program of the federal government. At the time, we weren't a suburban country. People didn't think that suburbs were even going to be possible. Who would want to live in a single-family home all the way out in the suburbs when they could live in a city instead? What a crazy idea. The developers of these suburbs could never have gotten a bank to finance them. The banks thought it was ludicrous to finance suburbs. The biggest one, you probably know, you've heard of it, Levittown, east of New York City. Maybe some of you heard a song that Malvina Runnels wrote about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky. They all look the same. That was a suburb just about as large as Levittown, south of San Francisco. That one was 15,000 homes. Levittown was 17,000 homes. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these suburbs in every metropolitan area in this country were created. As I say, no bank would be crazy enough to lend the developers the money to build these suburbs. The only way they could get it, the only way a developer like Levitt or Henry Dolger, who is the builder of the little boxes, the only way they could get the money to build these suburbs was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans, detailing the materials, the construction materials they would use, the layout of the streets, and making a commitment to the Federal Housing Administration that they would never sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required that Levitt and Dolger and all of these other builders place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was an explicit federal policy, not the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was written out in the federal underwriting manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders to create these suburbs. The manual said that you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer who was going to sell homes to African Americans. The manual even said you couldn't recommend a bank guarantee for an all-white development that might be located near where African Americans were living, because such a development might run the risk, in the words of the manual, and I'm quoting, the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. There's no reality to it whatsoever. It was the federal government that created a white noose around every metropolitan area of this country, reinforced with local housing authorities and local officials. The consequences of this policy determine a great deal of the racial inequality that we have in this country today. Those homes in these suburbs, like Levittown, like the little boxes on the West Coast, it was called Westlake, and all of the, here in this community and around Baltimore, Washington, those suburban homes for working class families, returning war veterans, sold at the time for about $100,000 in today's money, twice national median income. Any working class family can afford to buy a home for twice national median income, especially if they were returning war veterans. They could buy the home with no down payment required. They could pay less in their monthly carrying charges for these homes than they were paying for rent and public housing. That's how enormous the subsidy was. Well, African Americans were prohibited from participating in this program, continued to rent for the most part, either in public housing or in the private market in urban areas. The white families who bought these homes with this federal subsidy gained over the next few generations equity, wealth from the appreciation of those homes. They no longer sell for $100,000. I don't tell you that. They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, some places much, much more than that. The white families who participated in this program, working class families, returning war veterans, gained $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, maybe more in wealth from the appreciation and the value of their homes. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to finance their retirements. They used it to take care of maybe temporary unemployment emergencies or medical emergencies, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans had none of that advantage and gained none of that wealth. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. That's a disparity. There's a story behind that, too. That would be a third lecture. I can't tell you that, but just accept 60% income ratio. You'd think if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. People with the same incomes can generate the same wealth, you'd think. But the reality is that while African American incomes are on average about 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is about 10% or less of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, that's never been remedied, and that we, all of us here in this room and throughout the country, have never accepted the responsibility to remedy, as we must do if we take our responsibilities of citizenship seriously. Well, you add that wealth gap to the other gaps that I described before, to the achievement gap, to the health gap, to the mass incarceration, to the political polarization, and you have an explanation for the enormous racial inequality that we have in this country today. The policies to remedy this are easy to understand and easy to develop. It's not hard to figure out what to do about it. We could, for example, to take the example I gave about Levittown, we could be subsidizing African Americans to purchase homes in communities that otherwise would now be unaffordable to them, but that would have been affordable had they not been unconstitutionally prohibited from moving there. Subsidize their purchase of homes in those communities. That would be an easy thing to do. We could modify the regulations that govern the low-income housing tax credit program. So instead of placing a priority, as the Treasury Department regulations do, on locating low-income housing tax credit developments in already low-income communities, we could begin to shift those priorities somewhat so that we desegregate communities. We could challenge exclusionary zoning laws in suburbs that were created as all-white suburbs and where the exclusionary zoning laws that require nothing but single-family homes on large lot sizes, where those ordinances serve to perpetuate and reinforce segregation. As I say, the policies are easy to develop and easy to understand. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to be as effective and aggressive and insistent on remedying this civil rights violation, this unconstitutional system of residential segregation, as it was on insisting on the abolition of other forms of segregation in the 20th century. That's the hard part. Every one of us, I think, has a responsibility to participate in such a civil rights movement. As a result of the astounding attention, and I'm quite stunned by it, that this book has produced, as well as a great deal of national discussion about racial inequality for the first time in memory. In fact, we're probably having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race in this country than we've ever before had in American history. It's not just my book. Some of you have read Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Maybe you've read Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. Maybe you've read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and many, many other more academic books that have been published. We have white elected Southern politicians removing statues that commemorate the defense of slavery, something that was unheard of even 6, 7 years ago. So we do have the beginnings of a new civil rights movement. But it takes a lot more, and it's going to take all of our participation. I've been privileged in the last year or so to be working with a group of civil rights leaders, national civil rights leaders, to create a new national committee to redress segregation in housing that will be creating, I hope, local committees in many communities in this country, perhaps some of them in your region. And we're having a planning meeting later this month, or I guess next month, June. And very soon thereafter, I hope we'll have an announcement to make of how individual citizens, not just officials, but citizens, can participate in such a new civil rights movement. And I invite anybody here who's interested in getting a copy of that announcement to send me a note or give me a business card, and I'll put you on the list to receive it. So in sum, we have an unconstitutional system of residential segregation. As American citizens, we have an obligation, not just to say it's too bad, as I'm sure all of us say, but to undertake activity as citizens as well as public officials to do something to redress it. I don't know if we have any time for questions. A few minutes. Yeah, okay. I'd be glad to take questions about this, and I thank you for your attention. Well, if there are no questions, I'll thank you again.